Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Burnt Santee, thrilled to have Dan Hodgins on today.
Hi, Heather. Thanks.
So we're going to talk today. Actually, so I'm just going to give a bit of background and the quote here. So I'm going to talk for a while, Dan, and then it'll be your turn. But several years ago, before I knew any of you, I was at the Indiana AEYC conference, and Lisa Murphy was the keynote speaker. And she quoted you, and she said, as Dan Hodgins would say, we have to stop making developmental issues into morality issues or moral issues. And it blew my mind. It was such a great way of saying what I had sort of been feeling and trying to do. So I've mentioned it a lot on other episodes, and you and I have maybe even talked about it, but I wanted to do an episode that was specifically just about what do you mean and why is it important, and just get it out there for more people to have stuck in their heads.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it started for me was recognizing that every time I did a presentation, people wanted to talk about guidance and
Yes.
discipline. And you probably heard this a lot too, when you're out there.
Everybody is looking for that answer.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter what your topic is, it always goes back.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking, why is this so important? Why is the subject so important? And then I realized that people were looking at their own life in terms of their own upbringing and their own establishment and their own reasons for believing in certain things. And it all related back to some sense of morality issues. And then, of course, I read Kohlberg's, and Kohlberg is that kind of individual that's always been controversial, and stating, that children start out with an understanding of who they are and how the universe impacts them, which of course is the egocentric thought that Piaget talked about. Then he moves from there into 4 stages. And the last one is that universal concept. We do things because it's best for the universe. Well, some people never make it there.
Right.
Development. And then I realized that some people want young children, to be at the 4th stage. So when they say things like, you shouldn't pick your nose, people aren't going to like you if you pick your nose, all of that kind of thing, is really a statement of the universe will look at you differently if you do this behavior. And if you look at it in terms of all guidance and discipline, it pretty much all relates to somebody's understanding of what the moral implication is. And it's so much easier to look at it in terms of children do it because of their developmental level. They pick their nose because there's a hole and you fill it.
Holes are for filling.
It's so much. And then you say, store that in here. You hand them a Kleenex. There's no moral implication here. It's just a developmental concept. And then I realized that this probably applies to just about everything.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason it's so hard for people who work with children to move towards looking at it developmentally rather than as a morality issue. I mean, partly it's our upbringing and the culture we grew up in, but there's this feeling that you can't let kids get away with stuff.
Yes.
And so if we aren't treating it as morally right or wrong, then we're getting hazy and we're letting them get away with it. And so all the things I talk to people about, looking at it developmentally, and here's what you can do if you see a skill they need more practice with, or maybe they just need to get older before we can expect that of them. That translates into letting them get away with it. And I think that's another reason that quote really stuck with me, because it's a different way of processing through that idea that, well, then we're just soft, then we're just,
Right. It's like the subject of hitting.
Yeah.
People will say that we don't hit because those are our friends and we don't want to hit our friends. And I'm thinking, what the hell is a friend?
Right.
For young
Maybe
children.
maybe you don't want to hit your friends.
Exactly. And then they'll ask them, you don't want to hit your friend, do you? And what if they say yes?
Right?
You're stuck.
Yes.
In terms of that
Yeah.
component, where it'd be much easier to say, you want to hit this. And keep it at that developmental concept, rather than looking at how to make people universally friends.
Yeah.
And
And I
go
think
ahead.
we talk about, and you mentioned Kohlberg and that fourth stage of what's best for the universe. And people might be thinking in that way, they need to be good people. So I need to show them what's good and make them not want to do what's bad. But most often it's what's good for me and my daily schedule and my classroom functioning
Yeah,
and my how difficult this behavior is making my job. So it's not even really about making the world a better place, even when we talk about it that way. And I think that's another reason to talk about thinking of it developmentally rather than as right or wrong or good or bad.
yeah. And not only is it right or wrong concept, but it also, the question becomes whether or not it is developmental.
Mhm.
Is it the stage I'm at? Because I'm always, when I'm observing children, I first look at, is this typical for this stage of development?
Mhm.
If it is, then let it go in
Yeah.
terms of that component. Then you look at, all right, how does that impact the child currently, rather than present and past? Because we
Uh-huh.
always want to talk about the present. Well, what's going to happen if that child goes to whatever?
Right.
And I'm thinking, wait a minute, our concept with children should be present tense only. And
Mhm.
that's really difficult for adults, because we tend to want to prepare children
Yeah.
or something. I mean, the other day on Facebook, somebody said, how do you teach children to learn? And they were toddlers. And I'm thinking, what the hell? Why
First
would
of
you
all,
ask that
if you
question?
don't already understand that toddlers are driven to learn already,
Right.
that's maybe not your age group.
Correct. And that's what I wanted to say. And she was wanting activities to do with
Uh-huh.
toddlers so they would learn.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, you might want to move to senior citizens or something of that sort.
Or maybe a nice social media sales or something.
Correct. Right. Right.
Oh my gosh. So what that reminded me, I just read an article. I've been reading a lot of stuff by this guy, Peter Moss, lately, and he's from the UK. And I hadn't heard of him, and suddenly I'm looking at everything I can find. But he has an article talking about getting beyond the investment narrative about working with young children. It's not about how many dollars we get returned in the future for the dollar we invest now in early childhood. And it's not about necessarily the citizens that we get then. It's about, we should be really just thinking about, who is this child who's in front of me and what do they need right now, and how can I be with them in that? And yeah, then maybe great things come down the road. But if that's our sole focus, we're putting a lot on the shoulders of a 2, 3, 4, 5 year old,
Absolutely.
in terms of what we expect from their behavior. If what we're thinking is, I have to change all of this so that
Right.
she will be a better human later.
And I think that's what I've been thinking late. You know how, Heather, I go off and I think and wonder, am I the only one that's thinking this? Well, now I'm wondering whether or not teaching children, excuse me, whether or not teaching children about the environment and how to handle the environment so it's a better place
Uh,
isn't a moral issue rather than a developmental issue.
oh,
So, and I'm not suggesting that we're all responsible for making a better world, whether it be through recycling or whatever,
uh-huh.
but is it with the responsibility of young children to look at that in terms of the impact, when that's more of a future concept, a
Yeah,
school age concept,
yeah.
for example? The same thing like with gardening. I'm thinking, in my 36 years, I've never had a child ask me, could we plant flowers so that I can pull them up? during the day, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether or not we are taking issues that are really adult issues
Uh-huh.
and now saying, let's prepare young children for making the world a better place,
Yeah.
which is a moral concept.
Right.
And it's
A
not
better
an
place for
unhealthy.
whom and
Yeah,
by whose standards. Yeah.
exactly. And
So,
it's not unhealthy, but it's not developmental
right. So
for young children.
it's like a lot of the other sort of more academic stuff. We see what we want it to look like, and so we start pushing that model younger and younger. And I
Yes,
think the sort of ecological example that you used is good for this conversation, because if we're looking at it as a moral issue, we want you to grow up to be people who save the world, and that looks like recycling and gardening and sustainable stuff.
right.
But instead, if we just thought developmentally, children like to play in the dirt, they like to be outside, they deserve to be outside, and they need to be outside just because of who they are now
Yes,
and what they deserve now. I think that leads to those other goals in a better way,
absolutely.
because
Yes,
then they care about and they have this emotional connection to the earth and to outside. And so then when they're old enough and they're presented with the other information, they've got that connection already.
right. It's like handing them a shovel and they start digging in the dirt and then they find a worm. And then there's a major discussion about where a worm poops and how they poop
If it
and
has a penis.
exactly, exactly. Which are all really major questions
Yes.
for young children
Yep.
because it's developmental, which I agree with you. Then it leads later on to perhaps looking at worms as a way to filtrate and understand the concept. But
Mhm.
at the young age, it's there's different questions that are important,
Yeah.
and it doesn't mean that they don't care about the world, but they're not looking at it in a way
Mhm.
to save the world at this concept because they're not at that moral stage of
Right.
development yet.
Right. And developmentally, we know that children don't learn best by just hearing things.
Correct.
But when we get into especially behavior conversations, we expect them to learn immediately by just hearing us say what's okay and what's not.
Right. Right.
Um, uh, and we just sort of throw away what we know about development, that they
Well,
construct knowledge based on experience and being active.
sure, it's the same idea of the concept of swearing,
Hmm.
whether or not swearing is really a moral issue or is it just a communication
Hmm.
issue,
Yes.
and how we communicate. And I've been questioning people on whether or not who decides what's bad or good.
Hmm.
And to be honest, if young child had to choose between being nice, whatever that is,
Hmm.
and bad, they're going to choose bad because it's easier
It's
and more fun.
easier.
It's
Yes,
just
exactly.
easier and
It's
more
within their
fun.
skill set.
Yes. And so it's not, it's what we do is we move children into a morality issue
Mhm.
with the subject of swearing, and it really has nothing to do with moral.
Yeah.
It has to do with what I've heard, what kind of attention I get from it, whether
Uh-huh.
or not it's exciting. And by the way, saying certain words is kind of fun
Right?
because it does impact.
Right.
Uh,
We have all kinds of research now coming out that there's cathartic
yes.
effects from swearing when adults swear. And why wouldn't we think the same would be true for children then?
Right.
If we get relief from using the word,
Right.
why wouldn't we think that they do?
And adults will even say things like, let's not call it swearing any longer. Let's call it potty talk.
Oh my God, I just saw a meme yesterday about toilet talk that made me so angry. It was all about shame and feeling bad about bodies, because it's more comfortable for the adults when the children are engaging in that sort of uncomfortable stuff for us.
Right. Plus
You're
the fact,
setting them up to feel bad about their bodies.
absolutely, yes. And I keep thinking when I'm in the toilet, I'm usually not swearing because I'm usually by myself. And swearing has no impact if you're by yourself.
Right, right. Well, maybe if there's no toilet paper,
Well, that's
I'll
true.
do a
That's
for
true.
fuck's sake kind of a thing.
Very true. Yes.
Just in general,
But,
I'm not swearing in
but
there
you're right.
much.
I
Yeah.
think adults create these avenues because it really bothers them,
Yeah.
where it really doesn't have any trigger
Mhm.
of looking at how the child's going to grow and change and all that component,
Yeah.
in terms of preparing them by
Yeah.
not doing something.
It's another opportunity for us to break harmful cycles. And I
Yes.
think so
Right.
many people who come into the work, I've just heard so many people, myself included, talk about how I just wanted to be who I needed when I was younger, that quote, or I just wanted to break the cycle that I was stuck in. And instead we engage in all this shame,
Yes.
and it puts a wall up between us and the children that we're trying to build a relationship with if we're constantly thinking about whether they're good or bad, or whether they have done morally right things or morally wrong things, instead of just being human with them and understanding that they're at a different developmental level than I am, so
Right.
they're
Right.
going to react in different ways than I would.
And if we observe children a lot and carefully, we'll see that their behavior is typically based on their development, not
Mhm.
on their moral understanding
Right.
component. And I think that's part of the challenge when we talk about not pushing other children. Um, when you look at that, they didn't really ask to be around all of those kids to begin with.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
now we're asking them to behave in a way that's not natural.
Yeah, I
And-
was just talking to, well, it's the woman who does my hair. She has a toddler, and she was talking about how first he was the biter in the group and now he's the shover in the group, and she's taking it all in stride. She understands that it's developmental and it's going to be okay. But I said that, I said, children didn't ask to be in that group together all day, especially same age children in a
Sure,
group together all day who have the same developmental sort of levels and challenges that they're working through. um, so yeah, they're going to respond in ways that we don't want, but it
sure.
doesn't make it wrong. It's
No,
developmentally to be expected that children with, especially toddlers with limited language skills and limited experience with problem solving and
right.
interacting with others, are going to use, the tools they have to
Sure.
solve the
And with
problem they have.
toddlers, if you're in my way, I will push you out of my way. That's normal. Why would we want to make that abnormal?
Right? Right?
Because it's normal behavior.
Yeah.
And if we look at it in that way, then we don't make statements like, we don't want to push our friends.
Yeah.
It's not nice to push, because those kind of statements are all moral
Right?
level thinking processes rather than, move this way, move around this way,
Yeah.
let's move faster through this way, that kind of thing would
Or
be all
just
developmental.
factually saying, I don't think you saw him. You walked right
Right,
over him. And just sort of
exactly. Right.
using tuning in language to sort of eventually build that awareness of
Sure.
other folks in your space. But
Yeah.
also, I've had 50 years of experience working out what nice means and what I think it looks like and how I can do it. And they've got 2-3 years, 36 months of experience on earth to figure it out. And we're giving them conflicting and weird messages about what nice is
Right. And when you
when we
think
do that.
about it, as adults, you and I would probably have very different definitions of what nice is.
Yeah.
And a lot of it depends on what we can take personally in
Hmm.
terms of our choice. It
Yes.
has nothing to do with you or me. It has to do with, even as adults, we're looking at that process of what's nice. And that's why the debate as adults on how behaviors is probably always going to be there, because we're
Yeah.
looking at it in terms of how it impacts me rather than how it impacts
Right.
the
And
universe.
we get so annoyed at children for being egocentric, and we think it's something we need to teach them out of, but we very much function
Oh, yeah.
egocentrically through our day,
Sure.
without much thought about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think part of it is related to the aspect of, how it impacts us, what it does for us, whether or not it's important for us, which
Hmm.
is all that egocentric thought. And
Right.
so it's not that we ever lose egocentrism. We might just use it in different ways
We get
or
better at navigating it, I think.
absolutely.
But ultimately, it's a survival skill, right?
Yes.
That's come through us through, all the time of humanity evolving.
Right.
Um, that we really have to focus on ourselves for survival, but the skill comes with getting older,
Sure.
um, to navigate it and decide what is really a threat and what isn't.
Yeah. And, now there's a lot of books for children. I've noticed when I went to the bookstore the other day, the number of books that really imply
Yeah.
moral reasoning. I
Yeah.
mean, the Bearstein Bears say please and thank you. I'm thinking, bears don't say that.
Yeah, right. Or even
When
the books
children.
like, what are they? Hands Are Not for Hitting, Teeth Are Not for
Absolutely.
Biting,
Yeah.
that are very popular. They actually, in a study that someone did, and I think it was pretty informal, but they did over a period of time, they saw biting increase when they read those
Yes.
books because
Yes.
it because it
Yeah.
wasn't quite that's not how children are they're not reading a book about my teeth not being for biting, and then in a stressful moment when they want to bite, they're like, oh wait, we
Right.
read that book last week. So I'm gonna stop and make
Yeah.
a different choice. that's
And it
that's
comes
really
from some
naive of
research,
us to feel
that
like that's
indicates that children select books based on whether or not they can adapt to it,
hmm
identify with it,
hmm
and those kinds of things are not identifiable in most cases. I don't go around expecting that children are going to say please and thank you
right.
in
If
terms of
I want them to, if that's my value, then I just use it in my own language because I
absolute.
understand how language development
Yeah,
occurs in children.
yeah. The question, Heather, then is, does that make you a nice person?
To use those words,
Yeah.
oh, I think a case could be made that that makes somebody a manipulative
Yes.
person.
True. And so part of the challenge of this whole moral issue
Uh-huh.
is what we define as being morally correct
Uh-huh.
versus being quote sinful or
Yes,
bad.
the recovering evangelical in me.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes. Has a
And we haven't
real
really decided that. Well, I shouldn't say that because I think some
some
people
people have
have
decided, yeah.
made that decision, and that's why they apply it to their practices
Mhm.
with children
Mhm.
without even thinking about what's my goal, whether or not it's appropriate, and is it
Yeah.
really at a developmental level.
Right. Yep. This comes up so much, and honestly, where I use this phrase the most is when I'm teaching at the community college, especially the behavior class, but really all of them because it comes up so often in discussion boards or just the phrases we use. This is with a good kid, and some of the kids were out of control, and when they do observations and
Yes,
stuff.
yes.
So I introduce them to the idea, and we expand as much as we can. But just having that phrase, I think, is so useful.
And I think, one of the things that I get a lots in workshops is people who ask, how do you stop children from name calling?
Yeah,
Calling each other butt face and all of that. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, the
you
most
call them a butt
important
face back.
and the most important part of their body
Mhm.
they're using frequently in their language, which is
Right?
normal developmental perspective,
Yeah.
rather than looking at it as a bad thing, look at it as a good thing.
Mhm.
They're looking at trying to find out who you are and whether or not you have a butt.
Yeah. Right. And one of the goals in sort of social development and early joke telling is figuring out what the other guy is going to think is funny.
Right.
And butts are universally funny when you're 3,
Sure.
especially when you throw in potty training stuff. Like that has been the biggest focus of their life for so long at that point. whether my butt's clean or dirty, and whether
Exactly.
I'm going on the potty or not, and the big celebration and all the praise I get when I do it right. And now suddenly saying "but" is wrong, and
Yes.
it's so confusing for them.
Yes. Yeah. And again, look at how many of these experiences that are normal, going to the
Mhm.
toilet, etc., really have developed into moral issues.
Yeah.
And you're a nice person if you use the toilet and then flush it and then wash your hands, which are
Yes.
three major separate kinds of behavior.
Yes.
We now turn those all three into moral issues. You want to
Yeah.
keep your hands clean because then you're healthy and then you don't impact illness on others, etc.,
Yeah. Yeah.
which might be true.
There's definitely good points, good sides there. I helped a little girl go to the bathroom this week, and she had to go poop, so I stood in the bathroom while she was in there, because it's off the classroom, and, she came out and she was like, "Do you love me now?" And I was like, "I do love you, but I would love you even if you didn't poop in the toilet." So, I don't know if I undid something that was happening at home, but
Oh, I
it's like,
love the
I
idea of being
"Do
able
you love
to
me
love
now?"
someone based on whether or not you poop well.
Based on their pooping habits.
Oh, I love that
It was
concept.
sweet, I know, her face was
You
just
love me
so
now.
sweet.
Can you see that being established as a relationship builder? Oh, I love it.
Use that on your dating profile when you're older.
And how do you prepare children for that? If you want good lovers, how do you prepare them for
Oh my god, that's a whole other
Yes,
conversation.
yes.
Um, God, I don't know that I can come back now. Oh,
Uh,
man. Do you have other examples of that just are at the top of your head of when we make a moral issue out of a developmental issue? I mean, I think it really applies to any
sharing,
time we're thinking about behaving. Sharing, yes.
sharing. It's
Yes.
really become a real major moral issue because
Yes.
someone has taught us somewhere
Yeah.
that sharing people are better than people who choose not to share.
Right.
And they've turned it into a moral issue.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at Kohlberg's last stage, we would share because we impact the universe
Mhm.
and want to make it's like the world is a rainbow concept. Who doesn't want a
Yeah.
world of accepting? But
Yeah.
that's a last stage of moral understanding, and they've
Yeah.
now moved sharing way up to that fourth stage of
And
development.
the way we go about it messes it up so
Yes,
much, like
yes,
complicates it so much. We think and feel like, two children are in conflict over the same toy. And we feel like a nice child would just give up his toy and let the other one have it. But the
right.
other one then is learning some sort of questionable things. I get to what I want. I can just take it. If I make enough of a fuss, I get my way. The child who loses hears the word sharing and associates it with loss.
Yes, yes,
So we're not teaching them to be kind and considerate and, members of a community and all the things we say that we want when we talk about sharing. We're teaching them somebody wins, somebody loses.
yes, yes, yes. And I think the concept of sharing is way beyond the developmental level
Mhm.
of the young child. And I think so we're giving that hidden image that if you do not share, then you are a bad person.
Yeah.
And we'll even make statements like people will make statements like, don't forget, boys and girls, we share our toys at school,
Yeah.
which is a universal concept.
Uh-huh.
It's not really an individual egocentric concept. And
Uh-huh.
I think probably the best sharers are those that do not share, because that implies that they really want it, that they get to own it, they get to possess it, and that will decide whether or not they want to give it up or not.
Yeah.
But even giving it up doesn't mean that that behavior is better than deciding to keep it forever.
Yeah. And if
Uh,
we look at it developmentally, it
yeah.
makes sense that children who are egocentric by nature, because they have to be, because that's part of their survival and their learning,
Yes.
they have to focus on themselves for a while before they can focus on other people. Um, if we're looking at it in that from that perspective, then they need to experience ownership and control before we can expect them to look at somebody else's perspective. And we
Right.
don't give them that opportunity. We immediately get into this sort of good intentioned but wrong-minded
Yes. Yes.
um, messaging of you have to share. And I'm not a good parent if my child doesn't
Right.
share.
Right. So the statement that we share our belongings with friends, if we shifted that thought process, because that moves it to the fourth level,
Mhm.
if we shift it to you decide if you want to share,
Yeah.
keeps it at a developmental
Right.
level.
Or we respect other people's desire to control when they have to give something up. Like, we respect their perspective. We understand why they're holding on to it still is
Right.
much more, I think, conducive to people who want to think about what's best for the universe.
Sure.
than-
Sure. It's like saying to children, we don't hit our friends. Well, again, like we
I
mentioned
just
earlier,
did. That's what my mind
I just
always
did,
says.
right? Then the aspect, it would make it easier if we simply made a statement like, did you ask if they wanted your hand in your eyeball? Kind of thing. I mean, that's developmental.
Yeah. Or, I'm looking at her face. I don't think she wanted you to touch her
Right,
right there.
right. In those concepts, it's so much easier, I believe, to
Mhm.
look at it in terms of a developmental level rather than a morality
Yeah.
issue,
Yeah.
because the practice fits the stage of development the
Yeah.
child's at.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, I think we can be the cause of someone to quote be badder
Yeah.
because of what we do or say at that level.
Right. If it's a developmental need, then they are driven to
Right.
act in that way. And if we push against it, they have to push harder. And I don't
Absolutely.
mean that in like, well, they're gonna be naughtier. I just mean that's that their
Sure.
body's gonna tell them to do and their brain's gonna tell them to do.
Yeah. 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 The other concept that commonly is brought up is the idea of children who decide to lead. We have
Oh.
leaders and we
Hmm.
have followers. And sometimes there's a middle. I'm not sure what to call the middle, but
Uh-huh.
there are people who just don't know whether or not they want to be a leader or a follower.
Yeah.
So sometimes they just watch, which would be the looker
Hmm.
component. But I think we always view leaders as something, or excuse me, we view followers as something wrong, that we really want leaders and not followers. I'm
Hmm.
thinking, how do we have leaders if we don't have
If we
followers?
don't have followers, yeah.
I mean, have
Right.
you tried to play hide and seek by yourself?
Right. Yeah, it's true. You do need the
You're counting to
followers to get
10
any
and
done.
who's listening? And then you go to find him and there's nobody to find.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
or
we
they're
think
all hiding and no one's
exactly, but we think that following is a bad behavior.
Uh-huh.
And so we often will say to children, I've heard adults do this, they'll say to a child, you don't have to follow him if you don't want to.
Yeah,
And I know what the concept is. They want to make sure that children stand up for their personal rights.
sure.
And but again, that kind of statement doesn't indicate that.
No, and just assuming that
Hmm.
is where we get into trouble. Like, I can watch an interaction and see that the child being led isn't really all that into it, but doesn't know how to get out of it.
Exactly.
And then I
Exactly.
might say, I'm looking at your face and it looks like maybe you don't want to play that anymore.
Right.
And
Right.
and then I
And,
see how they respond. I was like, you can tell her that you don't want to play that way anymore.
right.
Or what would your idea be? And
Sure.
maybe we can incorporate that too. So there are times I think that we can guide that, but just to assume that anyone who is following a leader is unskilled or lacks confidence or needs our intervention, um, is where it gets messy.
Right. I watched a group of children, young children, especially 3 and 4-year-olds, like to herd, so they'll play the dogs and cats,
Yeah.
everything, and they're running around barking and or meowing, that kind of thing. And somebody will say, "Oh, I want to be the leader dog."
Uh-huh.
And again, an adult might interfere and say, "Well, we'll have to take turns being leader."
Yeah.
Well, that's a moral
Uh-huh.
statement, where we could simply say, you can choose to be your own leader, and create your own herd
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you want. Or have you asked him, if you could be the leader right now?
Mm-hmm.
He's going to
Right.
say no, but you can at least ask.
Right. Right.
I mean, that's not the part I'm saying to the child, but I'm thinking, but we interfere, because morality takes charge.
Yeah.
And rather than keeping it at a level where herding is how you work it out together
Uh-huh.
and figure out how you're going to do this, and it ends up being lots of people barking who are leaders, or
Yeah.
biting, pretending to
Yeah.
bite or whatever, that component is, and it has nothing to do, with the morality component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if we try to find some sort of adult analogy to that, well, I'll say grown up analogy because adult analogy sounds weird. Anyway, when you're deciding where to go out to eat, it's really helpful to have that one person who is going to get the group together and go, or you're
Oh, do
getting,
I need that? This is too
right?
many choices, and I don't like to make all those. I mean, I don't want to decipher all those choices. Just tell me where you want to go.
Right. There are definitely times when I am happy to be the follower and
Absolutely,
really
yeah.
welcome that leadership. So it's not all, if we think about, in adult situations, everybody's not a leader in
Correct.
our workplaces, in our families. There are roles and skill sets and preferences
And the
that
thing is, we make leaders, into moral
uh-huh,
individuals,
right.
and we make followers into less
Yep.
moral
Yep. Look at
individuals.
any performance review for
Correct.
any adult working
Yes.
in a job.
Yes. Yes.
Leadership is seen as the big thing that you want to get to, but we couldn't
Yes.
function if everyone was leading.
Yes.
So translate that down into 3 and 4-year-olds, it makes just as much sense.
Sure. And I think part of it is if we keep it at the developmental level, then our practices fit the
Hmm.
stage of development rather than our expectation of what we hope that the child will grow
Right.
into, whatever
Right.
that might be.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think I've talked a lot about teacher ego and the way it can impact. I think a lot of this comes from that too, because if my view of the child is an empty vessel waiting for me to pour things into its head and basically um, naughty until I teach them the rules, which I know people who think that way. They may not consciously think that way, but that's where all their practice comes from. um, that feels like teaching for some people because I'm in control and I'm changing the child. But it's so much more satisfying since I've sort of shifted myself into the developmental level and looking at, okay, yeah, I'm a teacher. I'm called a teacher, but really I'm just here to understand them
sure.
and
Yeah.
what do they need, and can I foster, can I support, or do I need to step out and let them work it through themselves? Do I need to just wait and let time and maturation take care of it?
Mhm. Mhm.
Which is so much more, I think, satisfying at the
For
end of the
sure.
day.
Yeah. Yeah. And to continue with that thought, as you look at if your goal is to make moral reasoning individuals,
Uh-huh.
then there's really nothing wrong with that goal unless you define what moral reasoning is for that person.
Yeah.
And I think if we look at young children being able to be present, being able to do the things that are important for him or her at that stage,
Hmm.
is how we get a moral reasoning. I mean, if we're looking at universal thought, first I need to look at myself and decide whether or not I like myself, or do I like not
Yeah.
like myself, and who am I around? How do I work with the people that I'm around? Which is what preschool children are trying to figure out
Mm-hmm.
in the world. If we look at that as a builder for universal thought, that's a different practice than constantly trying to teach a child to be moralistic in
Mm-hmm.
their approach. Because one, I think, gets that, and the other one doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the moral understanding. So,
Yeah. And I think it makes sense that people come into it on that moralistic side of things just because of how we've all grown up.
yes,
Um, but an intentional teacher who's really curious about development, I think will be willing to make that transition, um, and understand what they're feeling themselves about it, and what they need to maybe adjust in their work with the kids.
sure. And when you think about it, Heather, the real thought is, who decides what's right and wrong?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And all of us would probably answer me.
Well, if we're all self-aware and honest, we
Yeah,
would
yeah, yeah.
answer
I
me.
mean, it's
Yeah.
really down to me.
That's true.
And
Yes.
how the me's defined is so different in terms of their approach.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's up to the upbringing, it's up to our experiences we had or
Mhm.
did not have in some
Definitely.
cases, decides what that right or wrong is. And I'm often saying, if you're going to start a new program, one of the things you need to find out from staff is, what do they think is right and what do they think is wrong?
Mhm. Yep.
Because that really states whether or
Yeah.
not we can think in terms of development or moralistic reasoning
Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
approach.
Definitely.
And we
I
often don't think about it in terms of that. We think in terms of, what my experience was, what are my qualifications,
Yeah.
how do I work with other adults. But it really comes down to, who decides what right and wrong.
Yeah. I remember a couple semesters ago talking to a group of new graduate students, and we were doing orientation for the preschool program. And so we went through our sort of introduction to the philosophy of, helping kids with their behavior in our program. And one of the clinicians, when I was done with everything, asked if that's how I also raised my children. And I was like, well, yes, because I know developmentally this is true whether they're in my house or in
Right,
a preschool classroom.
right,
And they were so surprised by that. Because, and teachers who say, well, I know we can't really do anything here because it's childcare and because of licensing or whatever. I was like, no, it's developmental.
right, right. But
So,
it's easier to focus on what might have caused my understanding than it is to really look at taking responsibility for
sure.
my understanding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's hard. Anytime we're asked to become more self-aware, and it's more negative than positive for us, it's easy to shut down and just stop the work there,
right.
to become defensive of, because the other idea is, then if I've been taking more of a moral stance with behavior, now you're saying I harmed kids, and I've never harmed a kid in my life.
Right.
And there's just some there has to be some willingness to say, it's a cliche, but when we do what with the best we can with what we know, and when we know better, we do better.
Yes,
Forgive
yes,
yourself a little bit, let your defenses down, and think about why you're in the work. And we always say we're here because of the children. So if that's true, then that's the way we need to think about things.
right. Like, going back to the concept of hitting, I'm often asking people, are you assuming that hitting is wrong? You do know that we pay big bucks to watch people hit
Yeah.
at the Super Bowl or wherever,
Yeah.
hockey or
Yeah.
whatever. We pay big bucks, and you
Yeah.
don't consider that wrong.
Right.
In fact, if you don't see a fight, the game isn't worth it. In
Yeah.
terms
That's right.
and
Yes.
it's the same
So it
concept
may
with
be something
children.
we don't want to see. That
Exactly.
doesn't make it wrong.
Right.
It may be
Right.
something that we want to help get through, but it doesn't
Right.
mean that that they're morally bad people.
Correct. And plus, we put them in a position where hitting for children is natural because you're in my way, or I want this, whatever, is a more natural perspective. And I would be worried about children who
Who
did
never,
not
who
in some
never,
cases.
tried to solve a problem in that way.
And as a child who uses their words, which I hear constantly.
Yes, I hate that phrase.
Yeah, better than the child who hits. I mean, just
Right.
those two practices
Right.
don't match to me.
Yeah. And maybe the specific behavior that we're seeing
Right.
is different. And, we would prefer the using words because it's easier for us and better for them in that situation, maybe. But again, it's not that something's wrong with that child or that child is bad.
Yeah.
And needs a label. It just means developmentally he handles things different than
Absolutely.
this kid does, or
And
this
if a
kid's had
child-
different experiences
Sure.
than that kid has.
And if a child says you shit face, is that better than hitting? I mean, I'm not, more.
Right.
I'm just not sure which
Right.
one is better than.
We'll put a poll up when this
Exactly.
podcast comes out and we'll let people vote. Would you rather be hit or be called shit face by a child in your classroom?
True, but again, part of the conflict of the whole guidance and discipline really often relates to their moral understanding or not.
Yeah.
In some cases.
Yeah. Which leads to the kind of practices that are taught to teachers that only focus on changing and compliance and don't look at why is it happening, or if they do ask why it's happening, it's only to get them to the change that we want. We
Correct.
don't really teach people to think, well, yeah, I think it is to be expected for this developmental age that I'm with today to act in that way.
Yes.
And I'll try to help them, I'll try to support them, but I'm not going to make a moral decision about that child based on this. But we don't teach people that.
No. And as we've talked throughout this, period, how important keeping it at a developmental level versus a morality level is important, because it really all connects to this concept. And that's why, I made the statement and use it frequently, is because it does impact so much of our practices with young children.
And daily, every day, every minute of the day, we have an opportunity to think one way or the other, I think.
And when you think about parents and guardians who are bringing children into a program, whether or not they are a good parent is often based on
how the children are behaving.
Exactly.
Yes, definitely.
So you look at it as, wait a minute here, don't base your parenting skills on developmental levels.
Yeah. I see that pressure is so intense for parents. And one of the groups I work with is a play group where the parents stay with their toddlers, and clinicians are there sort of coaching the parents for how they can support children's language development at home. And but I see they're just constantly, the parents are constantly hovering because and I think it's just because they feel that pressure that my child might hit, my child might not share, my child might do something that will reflect poorly on my parenting. And that's no way to live either.
No. Yes.
We should just
there
be
would
able
be
to
no
celebrate
children
the
on this
children.
earth.
Oh
Yes.
my gosh. All right. So it's settled. We're going to think about developmental issues and not moral issues.
Good.
We've done it. This podcast is going to change it all.
Right. That's a universal thought, Steve. And I don't think we're there yet.
We're not quite there yet. Okay. Well, I'll continue to strive.
Right.
This was great. Thank you, Dan. Always so much fun to talk to you.
Thanks, Heather, for having me.
Yep. And thanks everybody for listening. Come back again next week for another episode.